refer to the. Great. And also before we start, I think it's very important maybe to explain to colleagues who are joining us today if they would like to access the notes and access the speaker's interventions in another language, they can use the translation at Zoom. Zaya, would you please explain that to everyone, how they can do it?
So for those of you, I will try to speak slowly. You go on the three dots where it says more or more in your language. You click on that. You will see something called captions. You will click on that. After that, Zoom will ask you to choose the language. Choose the language you want to see the captions in, and Zoom will provide you with the automatic translation. Back to you, Tahir.
Thank you, Zaya. Um, so So the Center of Competence on Humanitarian Negotiation, if you know us and you have seen this slide 100 times, apologies for that. If not, maybe it will be useful to know who we are and why we are doing what we are doing. So the center is a strategic partnership between World Food Programme, UNHCR, MSF Switzerland, and the ICRC. It was established in 2016 and it aims at enhancing professional exchanges and peer learning. The whole idea is really to bring together experiences from the field, those who negotiate at the front line, those who negotiate at the front line of politics and diplomacy for humanitarian objectives as well, bring everyone together to learn and exchange. We believe that learning is not only an individual experience, it's communal. And that's why we believe in the community of practice concept. It means those who practice the negotiations and the diplomacy for humanitarian objectives can always rely on a community. They can always rely on someone else who have done something similar, did mistakes, learned, and learn from that. So far, we have engaged more than 9,000 humanitarian workers um, spread out in all the contexts that you would imagine, the priority ones, from Ukraine to Palestine to Syria to Yemen to DRC Congo and others. So this webinar is about principles in negotiation. We launched by end of last year, we launched two research pieces. We call them Series 1 and 2. One focused on how humanitarian workers, so the professional individual negotiators, how they understand, apply, and negotiate humanitarian principles from their own experience within their own context, relying on their own understanding of the culture. And the second series, we wanted to focus more on the organizational perspective and the leadership layer. How leaders who manage organizations or teams, how do they put principles into practice? So one is about the individual skills and one about the organization, one about probably short-term decisions, one about strategies. And today we will be focusing on series 2 only. So this research was conducted through semi-structured qualitative interviews. We managed to speak to 54 humanitarian staff, researchers, and donors, and the group included senior representatives of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, NGOs, UN agencies, and donor representatives. And today we are very lucky to have two great speakers who participated in the research, but they bring both of them combined 50 years of experience that will help us to unpack the findings of this research. So we will be talking to them, asking them questions, and then we will see also from their experience and expertise, we will see how that maybe is mirrored in the research or not. So this will be a dialogue, a conversation. So feel free to ask your questions in the chat box. At any time, we will monitor the chat box and we will bring your questions and your insights to them. Um, and also, if you prefer to raise your hand, we will also unmute you when we take some of your reactions and reflections. So maybe let me start by introducing Lynn Hastings. Lynn has over 25 years of experience with the United Nations, working across the UN's main pillars of peacekeeping, political, humanitarian affairs, development, and human rights. She has worked in diverse conflict settings, including the Balkans, East Timor, Pakistan, Venezuela, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and the Middle East. Then, most recently, she was the United Nations Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process and resident slash humanitarian coordinator for Palestine. Now retired from the United Nations and based in Geneva, she advises UN entities and member states on a broad range of issues, including the UN80 process, peace building, while also teaching conflict resolution at academic institutions in Switzerland. Lynn, you're welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Sahar.
We also have Dick Kloman. Dick is Regional Head of Humanitarian Diplomacy, Liaison, and Communications for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in Europe and Central Asia. With over 25 years in the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, he's working mostly in the fields of protection, international law, and the humanitarian diplomacy. He has developed extensive experience in the practical application of humanitarian principles, including in contexts such as the international armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Thank you so much also, Dick, for joining us today, and welcome.
Thanks.
Okay, let's get into it. I think the actually before that, also I want to mention that we were supposed to have other colleagues from local NGOs. They couldn't join us last minute, but as Dick and Lynn are here today with this great diverse experience from the UN and beyond, and from the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement and beyond, I think we will try as much as we can to reflect some of the voices as well. We'll probably manage somehow. Of course, this doesn't mean we should replace anyone, but it is what it is. We couldn't have local NGO colleagues, but when you read the study, and I really encourage everyone to do that, you will see the perspectives captured in that research. So let's start with the first question, I would say, is from your experience, Lynn and Dick. How do you think senior humanitarian leaders and their organizations usually apply the principles in the negotiation process? Maybe I start with you, Lynn, to open this up.
Sure, thanks. And thanks everybody for joining. I personally am really looking forward to this discussion because I'm interested to see what Dick says in comparison to what I say, because I think our organizations are very, very different in terms of how we approach all things humanitarian and beyond that. From my perspective, I personally believe that it's actually rare for humanitarian leaders, at least in the UN, to rely only on principles. And I want to highlight the fact that not all of the HCs, the humanitarian coordinators of the UN, have humanitarian backgrounds. Often they're what we call resident coordinators. They're working on development issues and peace building issues, and then there's a crisis and they become a humanitarian coordinator. So sometimes we're in a situation where we have a humanitarian coordinator in the UN who doesn't have the experience. Never mind, of course, what we would call the political heads of the political or the peacekeeping missions, the special representatives of the Secretary General or the special envoys. Most of them don't have a basic understanding of humanitarian principles. Theoretically, they shouldn't be negotiating humanitarian issues, but they often do for various reasons, the biggest of which is because, of course, there are so often there is so often, even though there's not supposed to be, an overlap between humanitarian and political negotiations, and that's just the way it is. So rather than just relying on the principles, and I don't know anyone who would go into a meeting with an actor, be it an armed group or a member state involved in an armed conflict. I don't know anyone who would really go in at this stage and say, these are the humanitarian principles, this is the way you have to act. There's usually the person who's negotiating tries to find a pragmatic solution which doesn't compromise in the worst case scenario, or the best case scenario actually upholds humanitarian principles. And that can include anything from, highlighting the fact that not adhering to humanitarian principles could be a reputational risk for that particular actor. You're obviously going to suggest or emphasize the fact that you're there to help the host government with their obligations, not to lead their obligations. There can be lots of economic issues. And of course, some other member states may be encouraging that actor to engage with, be it the IFRC, international or national NGOs, or the UN. And if those other member states have a particular influence on that member state, then it does become much easier to talk about the humanitarian principles. I think I'll stop there because Dick and I and Zoya discussed making sure that we have more of a dialogue.
Thank you for that. Dick, what's your take?
Well, so my starting point is more from the local perspective, where we have, as you know, the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies is composed of 191 national societies. So that leadership that we're talking about is quite diverse and often national or local. And then, of course, there are international elements as well. So the question depends very much on the context and who you are and your personal background, because you can end up also in the Red Cross or Red Crescent with various backgrounds, your understanding of the role of principles. I think what is important and interesting right now is also the current era of uncertainty and the political quick shift we're seeing that is also changing the conditions for using principles and understanding the principles. We see much more, and I'll come back to that later, but much more politicization of humanitarian space and politicization and instrumentalization of humanitarian action in general in the field of work. My current experience is mainly in the context of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but also in many other European and Central Asian, quite complicated political context. So it's shifting quickly. And furthermore, I would say that the Red Cross and Red Crescent is probably quite unique in this sense. As you know, that the principles are like core part of our mandate and functions. So we were the ones first initiating these principles, and they developed organically from operational practice, and then they became political principles. But they're also part of our constitution, they're part of our mission, they're part of our objectives, they're part of our integrity and accountability frameworks. So whatever we do and however we turn our heads, the principles are there, the principle of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. So I think that might also impact us a lot. I would say even our identity and brand, and even we have the national societies have also an obligation to disseminate the humanitarian principles, or what we also refer to as the fundamental principles of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. So that would be the 4 humanitarian principles, and also voluntary service, unity, and universality as the additional. But also, in addition to that, we have a specific relationship to the state parties of the Geneva Conventions of 1949. So there is also certain obligations in relation between the governments and the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, which makes us pre-positioned to work around the principles, even if we use it at frontline negotiations. There is also a legal and political environment that helps us to understand these principles before an emergency hits. And there is even in Article 81 of the first additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions, there is even a mentioning, the fundamental principles of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement is even mentioned as an obligation of the state parties to the Geneva Conventions to work with the national societies or the ICRC and IFRC to ensure and enable our work in accordance with these principles. So there is a kind of a legal and political framework which is quite unique. But generally speaking, yes, we are using it. So as I mentioned, the range of negotiations that we undertake, I mean, apart from on-client negotiation, but for ourselves, it's status agreements, it's cross-border operations, it's visa waivers, sanction exemptions, and it's all based on the principles, but primarily on the principle of humanity and impartiality, rather than the four set of principles like neutrality and independence as well. And we can come back to that. Ultimately, it's a matter of trust building, confidence building, with whatever stakeholder is there that we need to negotiate with, and their trust and confidence in us that we have a pure humanitarian agenda. We don't have other political change agendas. So that's, maybe that's where I would like to start off.
No, excellent opening remarks. And like, I want to maybe start to dig into this a bit further. So Lynn, I heard from you this whole idea of, you know, you don't have to come from a fully pure humanitarian background, yet you can be involved in that as a resident coordinator, maybe, or humanitarian coordinator, and that can shape the humanitarian leadership in many contexts. And I heard a lot about the idea of how how we help but not to lead, which reminded me of the idea how we influence without imposing on governments. Um, and from Dick, I heard like from you, for me, like also Lynn, it's more about this how we build this partnership concept with governments, how we really try to work and coexist with them. And Dick, I heard more the principles, how they evolve from identity into mandates into commitments for member states. So I'm hearing here that there is no universal way to interpret and apply humanitarian principles to serve the civilian populations. So when I hear from you, then what are the different ways that you have seen in hearing those principles, try to understand them as a senior leader, whether a humanitarian coordinator or head of delegation, etc., and try to apply that? What have you seen from your experience? Maybe go back to Lynn on this one.
Yeah, so just to pick up on, I think what both of you said, this idea of the relationships and the partnerships, and I saw Haley Jesus ask about, how do you trust the armed groups in the chat, and how do they take
Yeah.
responsibility? And um, if you're working in a situation where there is conflict, you're probably going to be working with a host government and the armed conflict, in fairly equal balance in terms of how much you're interacting with them, because you will have issues with both of them in terms of access, trying to do independent needs assessments, those sorts of things, and what the government or the armed group is willing to do or willing to allow in the territories that they control. And so, yes, we will always hear whenever you're talking about negotiations or mediation, et cetera, how important trust is. I do also want to emphasize that no matter how great your partnership is and how much trust you have, you will likely not be able to change a fundamental core policy of that government or armed group.
Mm-hmm.
So, and maybe I'm getting into a little bit of the political stuff, but I've worked in countries where humanitarians were seen to be spies, for example. So there was really a distrust of humanitarians, regardless of your relationship, and that would lead to the requirement to engage in certain very um, onerous mechanisms, shall we say, in order to gain access to populations in need. So yes, trust works, but it only goes so far. So I think it's most important to understand the motivation of the party that you're talking to, what their core policies are, and how you can address, say it's a security concern, a cultural concern, something. How can you address those concerns without compromising the humanitarian principles? And sometimes you actually have to be really creative. And just because I mentioned Haley Jesus's name, when you ask how do you trust an armed group, this is going to sound odd, but just because they're an armed group doesn't necessarily mean they're untrustworthy. Um, so, you know, you have to have that experience. That building of trust works both ways. You have to trust them, they have to trust you, so you can help the populations in need. But most importantly is you have to know what their motivations are and how you address that motivation. I'll stop there.
Thanks for that. Dick, back to you.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And those motivations may also shift quickly over time in any given context. So it's also to really to be able to read and understand what's going on. I think it's also a matter of looking at both sides. If you're working across like front lines and on both sides of conflict, how also on solidarity on both sides. I mean, here we're talking about armed groups and on what it could be very unpredictable in some context and well organized in other contexts. But where I'm operating also in the context of full-fledged international armed conflict between what should be two parties who have an equal interest of applying, for example, international humanitarian law on both sides, the reciprocity idea of international law should work well. Here we also experience that the global solidarity towards one side of that conflict, like the political solidarity to Ukraine, that was instant. I mean, and also in the beginning of the escalation of the armed conflict here, also made it impossible to explain why you would work on the other side. So then working on the other side could create distrust with the one side that we have more governments kind of supporting and trusting. So I think that kind of dynamic as well, to understand the complexity of interest, and be it political, but also in this case, highly emotional rationale. So it's not maybe even rational, everything that you do. But this has really forced us to develop our approaches in a more nuanced way. And maybe also to add to the current information and like how we actually consume information, and the current media landscape is also so different from what it used to be. It's not that it's the mouth-to-mouth storytelling has disappeared, but people are connected real time. And one image can change everything overnight. And that could also have severe consequences. So the perception of neutrality, or even as in our case, when neutrality has been a bad thing, I mean, how can you ever be neutral in this obvious conflict where you should support one or the other side? It's also changing everything. So the algorithms and the social media has had a huge impact. And this also combined with mis and disinformation and what we now call harmful information, and in addition also dehumanizing rhetoric, which has also led to killings of people. So I think that landscape makes it more complex, and we're trying to understand that in a new way. And I think also there we just have to work together, more actors, and form alliances to detect and analyze those stakeholders that Lynn is talking about, and their motives, but also how those motives are fueled by the interests of others, kind of behind. It could be layers of motives behind, which is something that has shifted quite dramatically over the last 10 years, I would say.
Mm-hmm. You both are giving us so many materials to cover, and I can see the questions are started to get a bit harder, I feel. And we are getting into really good conversation. But I wanna highlight a little bit on the trust. So from the two pieces of research, we had two findings related to trust, and they are not the easiest so before this, actually, Zoya, just on the trust, they're not the easiest to reconcile. So in one piece, we found that we need to have trust with the people we negotiate with in order to be principled. Once I build trust and I build relationship, I can show up and I say, I have these principles, and this is how I try to position myself as a humanitarian organization. So the trust will open up a little bit, will break the ice, and the counterparts will start to understand, maybe respect our principles. There's another finding that showed us that actually you need to be principled in order to create trust. So I want to have your reflection here. Which one you think comes first? What is this relationship between being principled and creating trust? What have you observed? Lynn, you want to go first?
I
Or
can
Dick?
start here.
Yes. Sorry,
like
go ahead, Dick.
Yeah, no, please. But if you look at the case that I was just describing, that the fact that neutrality is not a goal, as you know, neutrality is a means. It's
Okay.
the means to achieve your humanitarian objectives. And our humanitarian objectives are humanity combined with impartiality. So it's impartial humanity, basically. That's the goal. Neutrality and impartiality are merely means, and they're not black and white principles. They're always in the eyes of the beholder. But in the context of Ukraine, neutrality became even something bad for us. So, but neutrality is there to build confidence and trust. That's the whole idea with neutrality. So then neutrality doesn't really serve as well. That doesn't mean that impartiality and humanity serves as well. So there you could definitely see that if you just keep on doing what you're supposed to do and you're reaching the most vulnerable communities in a way that you said you would do, that is the kind of persistence and enduring work you will ultimately gain that trust and you will be able to explain your neutrality. But in many contexts today, I would say neutrality as a concept for local actors, for example, when it's highly emotional. Take Israel-Gaza context, you take Russia-Ukraine. Even now I had dialogues just yesterday with colleagues from the Baltic states, where they are preparing for war, basically. I mean, that's a notion of the governments, at least, right? So what is neutrality when everything is emotional? And even for the humanitarians, because you're part of communities, it's your families, your friends. So I think we also need to differentiate between these principles and not talk about them as they were four legal concepts that are kind of binary, because they're not. Humanity and impartiality, yes, that we can actually measure, but to be neutral, sometimes it's difficult to measure what it really means in the eyes of the beholder, and as well with independence. Of course, we can create formulas for everything if you want, and we can assess. But I would say that in that sense, they're not perfect legal concepts. They're guiding principles. And first, we save lives, and that's the impartiality and humanity that should drive us.
Okay. Then?
Yeah, so from my perspective, the principles, I agree that the whole definition of neutrality has got us into some trouble every now and then. But, using the principles can help you to gain trust. So in terms of which comes first, I think you have to show the stakeholders that you're treating everyone the same and you're applying the same principles to them. One example I think is, and I think there's some colleagues online from Afghanistan, I'm taking this example from a few years ago, but the OHCHR, the High Commissioner's Report on Human Rights, dealt with the violations by both the Taliban and the government, the then government. And my understanding from colleagues who work there is that they felt that report and that approach, that the human rights violations, but this can apply to, violation of humanitarian principles or children's rights, et cetera. They felt that the Taliban was more willing to speak to them about their own violations because they knew that OHCHR was following up on violations committed by the government itself. So I do think that's very important. I think another thing is very important is that we all do our homework and our data is rock solid. Because I have been in situations where the information I get and you're compiling it and then you're working with a stakeholder and they say, but we think this is wrong because of X, Y, and Z, and then it turns out you're wrong and you lose your credibility. And you absolutely, you can't do that. You have to make sure. And the thing that I always find interesting is the situations that all of us on this call work in are bad enough. You don't need to exaggerate. So do your research, do your homework, and make sure whatever you're saying is absolutely correct.
I'm really hearing between the two of you like this, like I think you started really to break down to deconstruct the idea that principles shouldn't stay in the ether and there are practical ways to start applying them or believe in them. And like from both of you, I'm hearing do your homework, be aware of information you use, be aware of misinformation that you referred to earlier, and disinformation, misinformation, hate speech sometimes, and stay focused on why we do what we do as organizations. Stay focused on the humanity and impartiality, and try to leverage neutrality and independence to push for this humanity to be implemented. I started to hear all these practical ways that that speak to so many of the questions in the chat box, in the chat actually in the chat box here. I want to go back to this idea of neutrality, maybe a little bit on this, because I start to see it's coming out. So I don't think we need to ignore it, and I think it's very important. There's all the ideas that individuals don't have to be neutral, organizations can be neutral. That's one idea. I want to know from you what you think. Second, is neutrality different? Should we expect different things from local organization and international actors in certain contexts, in certain conflict? And does it make any difference if it's an international conflict or not? And whether it's an internal, a non-international conflict between a government and an armed group. So just your takes on the neutrality from your experience. What are your take? Start with you, Dick, maybe.
Yeah, I also see some comments in the chat on the neutrality, and I think we many on this call do have experience also on how you try to explain it. And I think the moments where we are really able to explain it and is when it actually how it benefits across front lines and how can it benefit like on both sides. So you may have a relative end up in prison on another side of a front line, or you may have where you might not be able to access certain services, and when the neutral actor could come in and benefit from that. So I think that's really when you can benefit it from your own perspective as a stakeholder in a conflict, and I think that's really where the proven neutrality is there, and where you are able to prove that you can continue to be acting as a neutral. The complexity of today's world is also that, I mean, also with decreasing funding and then the politicization, as I mentioned in the beginning, you would also have donor motives coming in and like moving into impartiality as part of the concept of neutrality and understanding of neutrality as well. And sometimes people mix them up as well, right? So you may be forced to work on one side, and that will perceive to be because you have funding only to helping, or in this case, you might not have funding that you can apply in a country which is under sanctions. So you may not be able to work there. You don't have access on that side of a conflict, or you might not have access to a territory. So you can't apply the principle of impartiality fully because of constraints, and that may be perceived as not being neutral on the one side or the other. I think what we need to do with the principle of neutrality, I know that some scholars have been talking about it. It's kind of old-fashioned. It's something that we used to work with. It's worked well on the Second World War, but now it's not there anymore. I think we just need to rethink neutrality a little bit and see, and also we are more moving into what it helps us doing. I mean, access, trust, and building those relationships, but also understanding why the impartiality side of our work. I mean, helping on both sides, helping the most at need. So I think that's really important for us to don't see them as separate legal concepts. And I see sometimes, in particular from governments and policymakers and donors, who they tend to see these principles as academic concept that you can apply on a system. And then when you comply or not comply, they can ban you or not ban you. I would say that there are very few who criticizes us for our work with regard to impartiality or humanity. But people are quite quick to judge us when it comes to you're not neutral, or you don't do this, or you're not independent enough from this or that government. So I think I think this is a conversation that we need to have, but it cannot happen only in a call like this. It has to be done by peers in groups all the time and on different layers of the organizations, including finance people and fundraisers and decision makers on higher levels. Because what they do, we can also impact the field level work, which we're mainly focusing on right now. But I would say that all of these layers are critical to understand what neutrality and how neutrality can benefit all sides in any given context, whether it's in conflict or whether it's, as we work also in increasingly politicized areas on migration, where even neutrality there can serve us to access certain migration groups, which are like with government can ban people from helping, for example.
Thank you for that. Tim?
So I think Dick has thought about this much more than I have, but just a couple of comments on this. One, again, for me, this is also why data is so important, because I think I've been accused of not being neutral because of what the data showed. But it's data, and at least I can point to the data, and if whatever, a certain amount of killings, or people don't have access to healthcare, or whatever the case may be, has increased. That's just what the data says. It doesn't mean I'm not being neutral. And then, I can sort of rely on the data for my neutrality, if you can say that. I do think, and this comes down to a lot of, okay, what does neutrality mean? Is it, an old-fashioned concept, et cetera, or whatever? But, I find a lot of member states think that being neutral means you favor member states and not populations that are seeking self-determination or something. And certainly, being a UN official, you're supposed to work for the member states. You're not supposed to work for separatists, et cetera, even if their rights are being violated, or they don't have access to humanitarian assistance, or they require protection of civilians or something like that. And so certainly member states, I think, have this idea in their head, or certain member states, that neutrality applies to them, which means it's actually, it's really not neutral. And that's really the only two things that I wanted to say there.
Thank you for that. Definitely a lot to unpack. And as Dick mentioned, it's not only in one webinar, it really needs to be discussed throughout an organization. And which also brought to us from the research, one thing very important is the how often organizations lack spaces for deliberations, to discuss, to talk about hard decisions, difficult decisions, to look back at what happens, and reflect on it. So we can see a lot of engagement actually on neutrality, but also other conversations as well. I like the question from Rehan, our deputy director, and I think it goes beyond only one principle. Like, how is it our actions that usually affect how principled we are or not, or the perception? So is it what we do, or is it what we are seen doing, or what the counterparts think we do? And how, as a senior leader, how can we reconcile between these two truths? And how much should we care about what the others perceive us? And we keep doing what we do. We keep going. I think it's a big question for senior leaders, especially in crisis, especially in conflict setting, where we talk to so many of them, we'll be like, okay, so if you're asking me every time I take a decision, I need to take a step back to think about it, then I will never be able to achieve anything. So maybe your thoughts on this from a senior leadership perspective and organizational perspective. How can
I
we
think
reconcile between, should we care about actions or should we care about perception?
no, today it's all a matter of perception. I mean, look at what young people are engaging today. I mean, of course, it's a matter of perception, and we are fortunate to be blessed with a strong brand, the Red Cross, and also the Red Crescent, which also creates expectations, right? So it also can work against us at some point. Why is the Red Cross not here? I haven't seen the Red Cross in this whole area where you should be there. So I think we need to consider perception, and I think it's actually becoming stronger. And with the current media logic and the current visibility and a lot of kind of me and us, rather than all of us together solving problems together. I also think, I mean, from also to comment maybe on the data, which I think is important, that we are evidence-based in our approach and how we analyze things. But at some point, the data is telling us way too late what we were doing. So what we are shifting right now is to do principle much more of our preparedness rather than our after action. Of course, we should do both. But right now, we're looking into preparedness mechanisms. Preparedness is also the biggest political investment field in Europe right now, and where there's a lot of money going from humanitarian into military spending and preparedness for conflict and preparedness in general. And in that, we also need to be prepared with principles. I mean, how is that integrated? Including principles underpinned by IHL, like the principle of distinction, and how do you plan, and do you co-plan and coexist? But that's where the dialogue starts with stakeholder groups in peacetime. So I think that's really a critical learning for us. And on the other hand, also in the learnings from the harmful information, many of you may have seen that the IFRC recently published our World Disasters Report 2026, which is called Truth, Trust, and Humanitarian Action in the Age of Harmful Information. It's a very interesting report. It's 400 pages, but the executive summary is 53 pages. it contains really, really good checklist of action points and recommendations that you should be able to do, which relate to this field of misinformation, disinformation, harmful narratives, and dehumanizing language and rhetoric. But I think the most important thing there is that the recommendation is we have to be much more proactive in our outreach. We have to be much more anticipatory in our way of thinking humanitarian action and preparing for humanitarian action, including in the space of harmful information. And I think there is a lot into that. It's easy to say as well, but if we don't integrate principles into those dialogues, it's not a matter of planning our resources, our supply chains and all of those things, but it's also a matter of planning for our ideas and who we are, our identity. And so I think that's one of the biggest shift that we are undergoing right now as the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, but also as a movement as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Lynn?
Yeah. Thanks. And yeah, certainly the UN has made a number of efforts in terms of anticipatory action, largely for natural disasters where there are floods that are happening every year or that, those types of natural disasters. There's, of course, an issue with donors and how to convince them to earmark funding for something that hasn't happened yet. But I agree with Dick that there has to be that type of thinking ahead of time. But I do think that even that type of thinking has to be based on data, because otherwise you can't convince the donors to actually provide that type of advanced anticipatory planning. With respect to your question, I think action. I am going to take the easy way out, because actions and perceptions are important, because of course you need to have the actions to disprove the perceptions if the perceptions are wrong. And it just an example from my experience after the war broke out in October 2023 between Hamas and Israel, after I sort of, got into a rhythm of things, I went out and talked to all the staff from all the UN agencies and some of the NGOs, etc. And, it was really shocking to me how our own staff really wasn't sure what we were doing or had misunderstandings of what our positions were. And that was a real lesson in terms of, I know our communications need a lot of work. And I think we need different skill sets in this era of dis and misinformation, which we don't currently have. But yeah, you have to make sure you start at home and make sure that all your own staff know what is happening, so that when their family members say, "What on earth is the UN doing?" they can respond correctly. So that's just a little anecdote in terms of the importance of this whole perceptions versus actions thing.
Thank you for that. And I see from Thomas saying our actions can influence our perception and vice versa. And I think we need to work more on our perception. And that is again where respect of the humanitarian principles become inevitable. And I agree, like what if you walk the talk, it will be affecting how people see you. And if you don't, then the action will be much more complicated. And I think we have seen so many organizations pay high price because of some actions are happening. Just remembering couple of weeks ago, as the one organization, international UN organization, that posted two different messages related to Gaza, which was seen as a very bad joke. On one, what millennial communication team would describe what's happening in Gaza, and one how Gen Z would describe what's happening in Gaza. And that's an action, and in terms of communication, and it opened a whole door of hell, basically, on that organization, especially on communication. And I do think it affected its perception so much. And we have so many of those examples. But just that one action, one social media post, probably consumed so much energy from an organization that probably have so much to do anyway. I think we are starting. Yeah.
May I also add there? I think there is also an
Please.
interesting feature in our work today, which is also very much driven by the need to do fundraising and marketing and the competition there, and the disconnect between what you refer to and we talk about here, which is more the strategic communication and outreach with an intent to save lives. And it's not to say that the money do not need the money, but the way many organizations run themselves, and in that high competition, also visibility and attention also drives us, including with the X thinking and like how social media is constructed, that drives us in a way that is not really helping and conducive to what you are referring to here. So I think we also need to rethink as well. I mean, how can we be more also across the sector, more coherent in our communications about the basic humanitarian values that we're talking about, what is underpinning our work. Unfortunately, we see right now globally a shift that is partly driven by the access to funding, but it's also the acceptance and understanding for humanitarian action as such. We see that some people are less worthy of getting response than others. Some crises are less interesting than others. Honestly, Ukraine is disproportionately overfunded. I wouldn't say that there are no needs there. There are huge needs in Ukraine. And we are there. We are desperately working to help the local actors in Ukraine. But if you compare it globally, like the principle of impartiality from a universal perspective, where are we? But this is also driven so much by perception and politics and how people are not equal. So those values that really underpin the whole work, that very idea of humanitarian action is also under threat. Whereas sometimes humanitarian are kind of portrayed as naive, or why should you? Why would you bother? And all of that. That is also impacting the morale of humanitarian workers and volunteers. We have 16 million volunteers in the Red Cross and Red Crescent working today, every day. 100 were killed since 2023. It's a very tough mission. And we need that kind of general narrative also supporting the work. And that's linked to our principles as well. So it's a broader question, and it's almost philosophical, but it's also very highly practical. So how do we defend the humanitarian idea is what we are reconsidering right now as well.
Yeah. And I think you're also referring to the fact that it's not the 1990s anymore. Now, whatever happens anywhere in the world, it will affect perception, how we are seen. Exactly what you're saying. And that's why we engage with so many counterparts across the globe, and especially in the Middle East, where I mostly focus. And we started to hear the narrative shifting after Gaza, as if it's like, you cannot tell us about your principles until you do something about Gaza. And we started to see that the counterparts compare. They look at us from a very global perspective. Sometimes even they combine every single organization under in one box, UN or Red Cross. The people that we engage with or negotiate with, they don't necessarily differentiate. So the idea is that as an entire industry, the humanitarian industry, are you being principled globally all the time or not? And I know it's an impossible ask, but it is what it is. They see our action everywhere, they compare, and it's not 30 years ago where maybe not everyone will know exactly what you do, and not everyone is tracking and monitoring your action. I want to move to Zoya, if you can show us the slide on the incentives. I want to move to this concept because we started to talk about that. We started to talk about what shapes the one before this one, Zoya. The one we started to talk about, what shape the humanitarian organization's action or incentives. And some of the things that came out from this research, the three big ones came out, is operational continuity. So principles enable trust. We talked about this trust, but like the idea that, we decide to be principled or not because of the need to continue operating in a context no matter what. Although there's growing evidence showing that principled positioning does not always deliver operational returns. So should we stay principled because we really have to, or should we be principled because it serves another purpose? And I think, Lynn, you started like the opening statement is that probably no humanitarian coordinator or resident coordinator will show up to a government and say, here are the principles, but they try to find solutions, practical solutions, pragmatic solutions. So that's one incentive came out. Second one is organizational legitimacy. So principles protect and sustain moral credibility and public identity. And I think it touched a little bit on the perception that we spoke about. Principled language can be invoked without being fully embedded in process and systems. So this legitimacy basically somehow can drive performative principled action rather than genuine one. So also maybe your thoughts on this. And last one, access to funding. obviously, and the role of donors, how they push organizations, maybe in an indirect way, I would say, maybe sometimes directly, to be principled or less so. So from your experience again, what do you think of these three incentive structures for organizations and leadership to behave, to be principled or not? And what else would you add to this list?
Okay, I'm going to jump in. When when we talked about the incentives and the disincentives yesterday while we were preparing for this call, I thought you meant of the stakeholders, not of the organizations. Um,
But I think
but
it goes both ways somehow. But
yeah, it does go both ways. But I think one issue, and Dick said it too. We got thousands of staff members across the world, and everybody has a different incentive. Some people want to keep their jobs,
yeah, yeah.
so they don't speak out on humanitarian principles.
Mhm.
And some people, some people would go so far with the humanitarian principles, and this is up for discussion, but that maybe a certain population that they could have provided support doesn't get support because of the humanitarian principles, right? There's this huge continuum in
Yeah.
terms of
Mhm.
the whatever, you'd have to put the slide back up, but the continuity and how organizations use these principles, because in the end, organizations are people. And it doesn't matter how many guidelines you have,
Mhm.
or
Yeah,
laws or
yeah.
regulations, etc. People don't interpret them in the same way, and they have different motivations. I will go back to motivations all the time, because I think that's really the key. And just in terms of incentives of stakeholders, yeah, some of them want to be seen to
Mm.
be complying with humanitarian principles if they can.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
certainly over the 25 years, I have seen less interest in being seen in adhering to humanitarian principles than maybe when I first started.
Mm.
And for example, armed groups, they may try and adhere to humanitarian principles because they want recognition.
Mhm.
So if they can insert themselves into some sort of internationally recognized process
Yeah.
without contravening some of their other objectives or motivations, then they might do it. It doesn't mean they're
Mhm.
doing it genuinely, but maybe they'll do it if they can do it.
Yeah.
So again, you really have to look at the motivations. Some countries that I've worked in, they're okay with accepting independent help. Other countries, they want to be seen to providing assistance to their populations, and they don't want the international community to come in and provide them with assistance, even though their populations are suffering. So, you really have to work with those types of actors, as I said before, to make sure they're comfortable with the supporting aspect and not the leading aspect. Anyway, for me, incentives and disincentives all come down to what your motivations are. I'll leave it there.
Thank you for that. Dick?
Yeah, maybe to build on this as well, of course, there are different ways of seeing it. But I think we're describing these three groups for like more for humanitarian actors, and but even local humanitarian actors maybe find themselves in different systems, so they may
Mhm.
not be connected with the international humanitarian system, which is regulated by the principles. I mean, for one example, the Geneva Conventions, for example, the laws of armed conflict, IHL, it doesn't speak about neutrality or independence, but there is a requirement of humanity and impartiality. So for you to have access as any organization, you have to prove that you're humanitarian, motivated, and you're impartial. That's what is described. So that's the kind of access we can guarantee under IHL. Well, there is nothing actually about neutrality or independence. So so it's also I think all of these motives or incentives are important for the sector to keep our integrity and credibility as well, and particularly in conflict situations. So not to mix up, for example, military motives with civilian. I mean, humanitarian action is per definition civilian by nature. Military has certain obligation as well to provide for the survival of the population and ensure and give access, but also to provide themselves under occupation and other parts. And that's, of course, they should save lives. But what we're talking about here is civilian activity. So I think for us, for the credibility as well, for the international community of humanitarians, it's important that we keep this. I think we're sometimes missing these conversations that you have triggered through your research. And I think even as I commented as well to you yesterday, Tahara, I read in the research, for example, that the first principle mentioned is neutrality. Well, I say it should always start with humanity. Because if we focus too much on neutrality, we will get lost, as we heard already, right? So we need to know these principles better. We need to apply them better in our daily work, in our daily thinking and daily decision making. And maybe we should even show how we're doing that in practice to teach each other, if nothing else, for the documentation and accountability. So I think there are many reasons for keeping it up. And of course, we should test, are they relevant? And maybe they're relevant in different ways in different contexts as well. And coming back to the very kind of being impacted by conflict or violence yourself, when you're self part of the victims or the survivors and communities, it is difficult. We also need to look at it from the relationship not only with those who are controlling the ground or the military or political stakeholders, but also communities and people affected, because they also serve a purpose in relation to the actual people and communities, individuals or groups, which is also important in terms of trust building, maybe even more important in the long run than any specific government. Because if you can gain that popular trust, that's also in the long run what we need in contexts such as been mentioned here, including also Sudan. But if we're unable to protect people, of course, how can they trust us? If we say that we should protect people, then we cannot. So it's also the understanding of what we can do and what we cannot do. Yeah. So that's when they're the principles is one framework to help us, but it's not the only framework that will help us.
Yeah, thanks for that. Then I want to get back to the motive conversation. I think it's fascinating. I mean, in all our trainings, we really emphasize the idea that there is probably no way to change someone's position without understanding motives, interests, and their values. But the question is like, individuals are motivated. These motivations are probably not always humanitarian principles based, but when we are in an organization, we ask our staff to believe in those principles. We ask them to sign a code of conduct. We ask them sometimes to give away some of the personal individual opinions, even rights, to adhere to these principles. So they represent an organization, to represent a sector. But we still see that this is not easy. So from your experience, really, how can, from again, an organization and a senior leader managing different human beings with different motives, how can we find a way to make sure that we are able to understand individual motives yet work towards a principled approach, a principle, whatever that is, humanity, independence, etc., that unify us under one flag somehow? How can we do that? How can senior leaders do that and encourage their staff to do it?
Okay. Oops. I got a message here. It's telling me to unmute, but can you hear me?
We can hear you, yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, that's a good question. Again, especially in our organizations, which are so big and so culturally diverse, and different backgrounds, and again, yeah, different motivations. And we do all hope that people who join our organizations do so because of the principles. And most often you do hear people say, I joined the UN or the IFRC or an NGO or something because of their work, because of the values they represent. Now we're getting into what does leadership mean and what does leadership look like, which is also for another series of webinars. But this is going to sound oversimplified because it is, but it is about setting the example, leading by example, taking responsibility. If there's a mistake by the staff or whatever, the leader should be assuming the responsibility, and all those sorts of good leadership principles. I don't think I'm answering your question very well, because I don't think there is actually any way you can make sure that they do it, because
Mm.
we can talk about management tools and those sorts of things, but they don't work.
Yeah.
All I can suggest is that you enthuse your staff members with the values. You show that you're willing to walk the talk, and
Leading by
that
example.
yeah, but really, I don't know that there's I'm saying there are no silver bullets anymore. I'm only saying that there are bronze bullets. So I don't know if there are any bronze
Mm.
bullets anymore on this one, but
Mm.
maybe, I don't know, Dick, do you know? Because if you do, tell me.
No, I don't know, but I think it's also I don't think we should overemphasize this. I mean, in any given response, as you know, the first
Mm.
responders are not us; it's the communities themselves. And do they
Mhm.
work with the principles? No, they don't. I mean, do they know the principles? No, they don't. But they have a gut feeling that not to
Mm.
discriminate and to save lives is something good. And this is
Mm.
coming back to those values that actually underpin these ideas and principles, rather than trying to dig down deep into the rabbit hole of independence for a whole day. But at some points, for us as partly international, and when we work, we need to keep our integrity. We need to be there. We need to be there,
Yeah.
and in everyone needs to trust us. We are seeing a huge shift in Europe right now with polarization in society,
Yeah.
where the extreme right, race of the extreme right, where actors who used to be working on the humanitarian front in the quite political center is now perceived as leftish or Greens or in a very negative way. So it's also a political shift that we need to navigate, and we need to change our approaches to build that trust. And that's the neutrality concept to me. I mean, how do you navigate these complexities over time? But the constant is always impartial humanity. And I think that's the leadership that we need to make sure that impartiality in whatever speech you give as a leader, however you instruct your staff or however you listen to your staff, that actually comes back to you, and how do you implement that? And also not shying away from the dilemmas of when you only have this much money, how can you help people? Where there are not enough resources, how can we help people? And when you don't have access, how do we work to get access? How do you continuously work to get access in order to keep up the humanitarian idea? So I think
Mhm.
that's where a leader
Yeah.
can play a role. And of course, make sure that if it's clear violations of neutrality, and if there's like clear politicization from our own end, or we're falling into and becoming instruments of donors or instruments of others, which is clearly against our principles, that we also stand up and say no to money and say no to others, and including partnerships. But that could be difficult. But that's where the leaders are needed to really to stand up and believe, but yet being pragmatic enough to be able to save lives.
Mhm. Lynn, I saw a hand. You want to come back to this?
Yeah, I mean, just, I think getting back to the full circle in terms of, how to get your staff to work, etc., and to adhere to the principles and to make sure they're applied, etc. And then the whole neutrality issue, and can we be neutral? And in situations where there's clearly, say, let's just use the terminology of one party is much stronger than the other. Even the strongest parties can suffer trauma, or can have humanitarian needs on specific examples. And so I think in those situations, especially where staff might not think you should provide support to quote unquote the other side, if there is a demonstrated need, pursuant to an independent needs assessment, et cetera, I think you have to show the staff that you are going to provide that assistance in accordance with the principles, no matter who the other side is.
Thank you for that. There are two things that are really interesting written in the chat box. So I want to repeat them because I do like them. Reem saying also to listen to, where is that? To them, I think you meant the staff, the local staff, understand their position, especially that local staff are part of the affected population. So understanding while guiding them to adhere to the principle is essential. And I think also Hassan is saying maybe you cannot be neutral in your heart, but you must be neutral in your function. We are all humans at the end. Um, and I think,
I
Len,
think
you
this,
started to
if
say,
I, if
yeah,
I may I just comment on this, because I think it's so
please.
critical. We talk a lot about with our local volunteers and staff about emotions as well. And I think if we
Yeah.
don't acknowledge this, if
Mm-hmm.
it's okay, it's fine to have emotions, it's okay. But and how
Mm-hmm.
do you manage this? And also it actually has a strong stress factor on it as well. And also when we put a lot of pressure applying the principles in a context where it's very difficult, and we can actually even cause mental health and psychosocial stress into this whole situation. So how can we also work around this and talk about it? Because I think this is so important, just the fact that we mention it and acknowledge that this is challenging. And then we work around it, but not pretend that we're perfect in an academic principled way, because that's not the idea with the principles. And then the principle, if we don't do this, principles will become a burden, a liability to us, and not an asset.
Absolutely. Yeah. And with all the evidence about acknowledging an emotion, especially like stress, will help diffuse it, will have de-escalated, compared to completely ignoring it and how much it affects. I know we've seen, Lynn, you've probably been in so many of those negotiations when without acknowledging the the stress and the concern of the other party, how much it will affect the negotiation itself and probably even cause a stalemate as well. I want to move to Zoe, if you can show the last slide, and maybe the last thing I want to have your take on is so our great researcher, Rachel Sider. So shout out to her because she wrote this research for us. She did the interviews. She also mapped out four organizational slash leadership behavior because I think as we established, organizations are people. So I wanna maybe go through that. So yeah, and the last one, yeah, here. So she looked at these four ways of how organizations react. Sometimes they react to the incentives, whether they are internal or external. They're coming from counterparts, from the complexity of the context, maybe. And then they try to adjust their own leadership style. And we have seen like organizations, they can be custodial in a way that principles as inheritance to be protected and transmitted across generations and contexts. So protect the principle and the perception of us being principled as organization, no matter what. And she looked at that and showed that there is strength in the predictability and decades of consistent practice carry trust. So we have seen that in many communities. The people say, "Oh yeah, you belong to this organization X. I know you, you're principled, etc." And how much that affects us positively. But she also saw a risk to this behavior that is that organization might struggle to adapt when context doesn't align with inherited frameworks. Tradition is defended rather than reaffirmed. And then she also found out the stratified behavior where authority and practice structurally split between field and headquarters. We all have seen those organizations, and the HQ says something, the field says something. Within the same country, the the fielder field says something else. And there we can see a lot of risk on that one, where the escalation pathways can be unclear, authority concentrated and upward, but responsibility is downward. Someone's take the credit that is usually in the HQ level, where someone else pays the price, and they're usually the downstream, maybe staff or field based. Then she looked into the reflexive behavior. So, principle as living commitments. She found out that some organizations and leaders basically the staff or the leaders interrogate whether practice aligns with aspiration. Discomfort is tolerated, open conversation is welcome, and the challenging is welcome as well. And she found that that has a lot of strength and that actually improve the quality of negotiations. And the final one, transactional. So principles invoked instrumentally when they serve objectives, deprioritize when they create friction. And the risk of that, sophisticated interlocutors recognize when principles are negotiable and pressure is applied at those points. Somehow, in a way, the counterparts can take an advantage of this transactional leadership style. They might even use it for their own, sake, looking at divide and conquer strategies. So I want to have from you your perspective on these four. Have you seen them? Have you seen others? Is this a spectrum? Is it continuum? Yeah. Any thoughts on these four types?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have seen them,
Mhm.
and probably all of them within the UN, never mind from
Yeah.
outside of the UN,
Yeah.
because I think we're supposed to be the custodial organization of a number of, maybe not the humanitarian principles, but certainly a number of international obligations. And then there is the reflexive one. I think, especially in the field, there's much more, they're more reflexive, they're more adaptive, so to speak. Clearly, there's a difference between headquarters and the field. Often. And then, I think Dick said this, we're really at risk of becoming, I don't think you said exactly contractors for donors, but doing what donors are wanting us to do because we need the money. And hopefully they don't breach humanitarian principles, but is not necessarily what our core mandate would be, or the core mandate, for example, of the UN agencies. I mean, UN agencies in particular, and I think NGOs, national or international, are particularly susceptible to this pressure because they need the money. So I think, I don't know if it's a continuum or not. I think some organizations would prefer just to stay custodial, but I think, as Rachel's writing implies, they will be left behind if they cannot adapt to the situations. Stop there.
Thanks for that. Dick?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's also to various degrees and yeah, maybe helpful concepts. I think few organizations actually have the infrastructure and the resources to fully apply the principles that they should be. I mean, if you put in the perfect world, well, what are they? How do we want to describe them, and how do they work? Do they have the resources to support the field people really to kind of feel safe in navigating this, and headquarter like expectations and policy expectations, and I would say there are a few actors who are really have the capability of really enforcing the principles to kind of from the beginning, from the idea to the very kind of end. And how do you then work along these different approaches, and what is acceptable, not acceptable, and how can you help each other to stay principled and lead the work in a good way? But I've definitely seen the types, whether it's helpful or not, and it goes beyond the principles. Actually, these four types, I would say, it's not only related to the principles, but definitely. But I would see we are sometimes looking at who are the organizations who really have the capability and resources. I mean, MSF definitely has the ability to kind of keep the integrity in itself. UN is a highly politicized organization. To some extent, in some circles, the Red Cross is also very local in its essence, like in its being. I mean, how can you work in countries like China, North Korea, Iran, Russia? What does it mean to be neutral in those contracts, and what does it mean to be independent? Because you're part of communities. Our members and our volunteers are part of communities, but yet there are guiding principles, and yet they apply them, and they're doing a great job. I've been visiting a lot in Russia over the last years, and I would say I'm quite impressed how volunteers and local staff are committed to principles and asking questions about principles, ideas of being a patriot and still applying principles, and how do you do this? And there we need a way of working together, and in a smooth way we can support each other to apply principles in a meaningful way that helps us to achieve our objectives, and that's everything.
Thanks for that. I have a final question, and it's for you and for everyone also online. So I'm putting it on the chat box. So I would like everyone to maybe engage on it and also give you a minute to think. Have you seen practical and successful way to put principles into practice by organizations and leaders? And if you can give examples. I think we talked on so many of those tactics, and I think we emphasized that there's no one way to do it. And we emphasized the walking the talk, showing the example, do your homework, scrutinize the information, the data. I think we looked into a lot of tactics. I want to maybe close with this final question for everyone. If you have seen it, what have you seen? And what can be this final practical tips for leaders and organizations if they choose to be principled? How can they do it?
I'll jump in here. I
Yes.
think one of the most important things is that they can't do it alone. That I don't think I've ever seen just a negotiator walk in and be able to negotiate things. They need to look at what happens what happens before walking in, what happens at the table, what happens outside the table, who is influencing. the main parties who can influence them helpfully, who are the spoilers. So it's whenever, I'm teaching some negotiations now, and I always say, it's not just about the room. It's
Hmm.
more about the before and what's outside of the room that's going to change what happens inside the room. And so I just think people need to make sure they look around and see who can help them. If you're struggling in terms of access, who are your allies? I'll let other people jump in now.
Thank you for that. Dick?
I was hoping for someone else to also to come in here, but I mean, yeah, many examples what we have, but I think I would like to look at maybe the legal environment and maybe non very atypical work we are doing. We were running operations in the Mediterranean Sea for some years together with the organization SOS Mediterranee. And there was basically the legal environment that were constituting barriers to our work. So we were blocked by picking up and doing a second rescue round, and like really in contradiction to the principle of impartiality that we should be able to help at all times. At the end of the day, whenever we were able to find pragmatic solutions and then increasingly challenging legal and political environment, which is also linked to European EU migration policies, it was the kind of individual negotiations between a captain and the harbor, who was it? I mean, or the captain and the local authorities. So it's how do you? I mean, so at the end of the day, you can talk about political and legal environments, but at the end of the day, it was a matter of this is a matter of the life-saving efforts. Having said that, I think we shouldn't underestimate the current gradual shifting norms globally in the legal and political environment that may make it impossible for us to work in the future. So I think we should really pay attention to the legal and political environment to help us to build like the future humanitarian space that we need to build, where that is one component of many.
Hmm. Thank you for that. No, between the two answers, really looking at inside and outside the meeting room, looking at before and after the negotiation, and looking at beyond that, what's the legal framework that you have to put in place. So between the two answers, really, it's like how this, as a leader and an organizational leader in this sector, is like you don't have an easy job. You need to have the 360 overview all the time, and you cannot turn. We are not owls. We cannot turn our neck that much. So rely on others, work with others, and collaborate. I see Asma responding in the chat. As a health professional working in Sudan, I have seen organizations apply humanitarian principles by prioritizing the most vulnerable populations, even in difficult conflict settings. For example, during medical missions and emergency health response services were provided according to needs assessment rather than political, ethnic, or geographic considerations. Thank you so much, Asma, for this strong reminder. Anyone else would like to write in the chat box or raise your hand if you have seen some practical and successful ways to put principles into practice? Thomas, principles to be put in practice, we need to create awareness of the principles at all levels. That is, all stakeholders should have an understanding of the principles. Ignorance to principles is a hindrance to access. Thank you for that, Thomas. And Mahasen, Nelson Mandela, situational leadership, principles applied, flexibility and empathy in leadership. Example, during South Africa transition from apartheid, Mandela adapted his leadership style to unite diverse groups, balancing firmness with reconciliation. Thank you so much for this strong leadership reminder as well of Mandela, Mahasen. Well, with this, maybe final words, Lynn and Dick, anything you would like to add before we close?
I don't know. I have this great cartoon that I used to have on my desk. It's not going to go over well, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's I guess it's a seagull with a frog in between his beak, and it says "Never give up."
Never.
So those are my last words.
Dick, do you have any cartoon on your
No, I
desk?
have no cartoon. I also want to thank you for doing this research because it has been really helpful, and I think it also helps all of us to kind of move forward. And I also say internally within our big organization is that this also has to have a budget line. I mean, working around the principles is not something you can just take for granted. It's not just for onboarding on HR. Actually, if you want to be strategic and you do your stakeholder mapping and you have to work around it, and then principles must have a budget line. And I think that's maybe my last word.
Yeah, never give up. Have a budget line to back you up. Thank you so much for that. Zoya is also posting the links to the research and the recordings of the other webinars we have done. If you know how we work as CCHN, we really, nothing stops. We start from a research, we talk to people, bring in experts, and we keep fighting, we keep pushing for it. So if anyone is really interested to know more what we plan to do on principles and negotiation, please reach out to us. We are easy to find, and maybe Zoya, you can put the our email address, the info email address. So if you have any idea, if this triggered any idea, and if you read the report, you have other ideas, we are really happy to talk and chat about what we can do with the findings, because that's what we really want to push forward. Thank you all for joining us from all over the world. We had around 85 joining us today. Thank you so much, Dick and Lynn. I really appreciate joining us and all the wisdom that you brought to this. Stay safe wherever you are, and we stay connected. Salam,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody. Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you, everyone.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.